Hello again, and welcome back to another Amber Roots devlog. Today we're going to start working on the skills and ability system for the game. But before we get into that, I want to introduce you to someone. Meet Pengu. This is the first monster that I've officially named, which is crazy to think about, but naming is really hard. I'm pretty happy with how this one turned out, but as always, I'd love to hear what you guys think. But now it's time to work on some abilities, and let me explain how exactly abilities will work in Amber Roots. Alright, so here's what I've got planned for the ability trees. There will be two types of ability trees, and the first one that we're going to look at is what I'm calling the species ability tree. Species ability trees will be the same for different monsters of the same parent species. For example, let's look at Pengu. Now, Pengu is a baby or basic form of the penguin species. As it grows, you will have a choice as to what you want it to transform into. If you want it to be a more defensive creature with a lot of HP, you might make it an Imperiguin. But if you want it to do more damage and be more of a heavy hitter, you might turn it into a Pinja. But all three of these creatures are part of the penguin species, so they all have the same species ability tree. Alright, so here's an example of what Pengu's species ability tree might look like. Now this is a very simplified version, but I think it's enough to get the point across. Every species ability tree will have a starter ability that will be kind of a freebie, an inherent ability that every one of those monsters will start with. After that, it'll branch off, so you'll have to decide how you want to grow your monster's abilities and skills. These abilities here that are outlined in orange are transformations, what in other monster games is usually called evolution. Acquiring one of these abilities will transform your monster into one of its transformations. In the case of Pengu, the defensive transformation would become Imperiguin, where the offensive transformation would become Pinja. What separates these transformation abilities from the others on the tree is that once you pick one for your monster, you won't be able to take the other transformations. Effectively, this will lock you out of certain parts of the tree. Alright, so let's look at the other type of ability trees, and I'm calling these the universal ability trees. You can kind of think of these as job systems from other games. Universal ability trees will have two tiers, a tier 1 or basic ability tree, and a tier 2 or advanced ability tree. Tier 1 trees will be open to all monsters, there will only be a few of them to choose from, and they'll be more general and less specialized. Tier 2 ability trees will have requirements that must be met, they'll also be more plentiful, and they'll be much more specialized. In case you're curious, this system is heavily inspired by my first and favorite MMORPG, Star Wars Galaxies. I played this a lot before they changed it drastically, and I just think it had such a cool profession system. You would start off as a simple profession, and then you could specialize into elite or hybrid professions as you grew. But I'm sure not everybody played Star Wars Galaxies, so let's look at an example of how this will work in Amber Roots. So here we've got some universal ability trees. We've got some tier 1 basic trees and some tier 2 advanced trees. So the basic trees we've got are the warrior tree and the mage tree. These are more or less structured just like the species ability trees, except they don't have any transformations. So all the trees have a starting ability, and then they branch off into multiple abilities. Every tree here also has a master ability. Tier 2 trees work pretty much the same way, except they'll have abilities as requirements for their starting abilities. So in this example, the Tier 2 ability trees are the Bulwark, the Battle Mage, and the Elementalist. The Bulwark will have the Warrior Master ability as a requirement, the Elementalist will have the Mage Master ability as a requirement, and the Battle Mage will have both. So the Bulwark and the Elementalist are direct advancements of the Warrior and Mage, where the Battle Mage is a hybrid. Now it's time to hop into Unity and make all of this happen. Alright, so I've been working a ton on this system, and I gotta say, some aspects of it were a lot harder than I thought they'd be. In particular, keeping all the different scripts with a good naming convention, and setting up exactly what I want each thing to be called was really hard. but at the end I came up with a system that I think is at least sensible and is working great for now. So first of all, I made a few changes. Since I decided to try out this notebook style UI, I moved a few things over to work in this style. Most notably, I can now access the monster selection screen and the team screen from here, and they both work well with the notebook style. I can also now access a monster's summary. From the summary screen, which is very empty right now, I can access a monster's skills and abilities. And this is where things start to get interesting. This is also where the naming convention that took me so long to come up with comes to play. It's funny, sometimes when you play games you don't really think about this sort of thing, and even going into the system I hadn't thought out what I wanted to call everything. But coming up with terminology that makes sense and is consistent across the code and in the way that I present it on these videos was really tough. So here's what I've come up with. On the left side here, you can see that there are a few boxes. This is what I'm calling skills. Skills will basically be what your monster is good at and how good they are at it. Right now I've only got 3, health, mana, and fire mastery. But with the system I made, it should be really easy to add all sorts of new skills. Health and mana are a little bit separate because I just found them to be so important and so relevant to every monster that I wanted to make them appear sort of at the top of the page here. But most other skills will appear where fire mastery is here, and you'll have a long list of them. So these will basically be numbers associated with a particular concept, and the higher the number, the better your monster will be at that. In the case of health, it's pretty easily visible. The higher your health, the more health your monster will have in combat. Some skills will be a little bit less obvious, for example fire mastery. Fire mastery will be a skill that governs both how good your monster is at dealing fire damage and how resistant your monster is to fire damage. So skills will be pretty broad and varied, but generally the idea will be that every monster has some score in every skill, and that score will determine how good your monster is at that skill and what it governs. Okay, so how do you improve these skills for your monsters? Well, let's look at the right hand side. I made 2 tabs to represent the 2 ability trees that I'm working on. Going from the earlier example, I'm working on the warrior ability tree and the mage ability tree. Now, these are just for testing and are nowhere near complete, but they work really well for what they are. So here's where the other part of the naming convention comes in. Rather than calling these skill trees, I'm calling them ability trees. And everything inside these ability trees will be called abilities. As I mentioned earlier, you can also think of these as job trees, representing the role that your monster will have. When acquired, abilities will grant your monster skills, and they might also grant combat abilities, like Fireball for example. Now these are just universal ability trees. I haven't gone into making the species ability trees yet because those are going to be a little bit more complicated, but the way I've made these work right now is that the first ability in the tree is free, so any monster can learn it, and the abilities that come after that will have some sort of requirement. For example, if I click on Fireball 2, my monster can't learn it because it has Fireball 1 as a requirement. So ability requirements are working pretty well. In the future, there will also be experience requirements to learning these abilities, but I haven't implemented that yet. I also want to mention that the way I'm animating the ability tree UI, where the buttons scale up when you hover over them, is by using a technique called tweening, something I didn't know existed until not that long ago. And I gotta say, I'm really impressed with this. It's really quick and easy to use, and I think it looks great. I'm using the free Lean Tween asset from the Unity store, and I'm really happy with it. I'm going to continue to experiment with it and learn more about it, so that hopefully I can make the UI feel a lot better. Alright, so back to learning abilities. So if we teach our monster a couple of these, we can see that their skills on the left are changing. In addition to that, some of these will show up as moves in combat. Let's go take a look. So first off, in the combat screen, a few things have changed. I made a new selector for the monsters to show who's currently active, and I added a sort of pulsing animation of it scaling up and down, and I did this using tweening as well. I think the result is much better than what I had before, but let me know what you think. I also added some very basic damage pop-ups. So if I attack one of these wild monsters with one of mine, you can see that a number pops out indicating how much damage the standard attack did. And once again, the damage animation is done using tweening. So let's look at the abilities. Now when I click on the ability button, it opens up a screen of all the abilities that this monster knows. It's also worth noting that the system only pulls the abilities that have combat actions associated with them. So abilities that were pure skill increases or passive abilities don't get pulled into this list. If I click an ability, I can then pick a target for that ability, and it performs it, giving us a different outcome than the standard attack would. In this case, the first rank of Bash does 25 damage instead of 10. I even added some abilities that might have different effects. For example, Fireball has a chance to burn. When the burn is successful, you can see that the damage pop-up not only shows how much damage Fireball did, but it also shows that the burn status effect has been applied. I really wanted to work on these damage pop-ups so that everyone watching these videos can get a better view of what's going on in combat without having to look at the Unity console. This is especially true during the enemy turn, so you can actually see that something is happening. Now that the enemies have gone though, you might notice that the health of my monsters hasn't actually decreased. This is because even though attacks have a damage associated with them right now, I'm not actually subtracting it from a monster's health. The reason for this is that I don't have any code written up to determine what happens when a monster's health drops to 0, or when all monsters' health drops to 0. In the future, you can imagine that you can either win or lose a battle, depending on that. But since that's not implemented yet, I decided it would just be cleaner if I wasn't subtracting that value at all. That way the health doesn't get down to 0 and I don't have to worry about healing the monsters and things like that between battles. Especially since I'm going in and out of these battles just for testing purposes right now. Speaking of testing purposes, another thing I implemented was a reset abilities button. And this does exactly what you think. It removes all the abilities a monster knows and resets their ability trees. This button is not something you're going to see in the final game, but it really helps me to try out different things and to experiment and make sure everything's working okay. Another thing I want to mention is that I'm not entirely happy with how this UI is turning out right now. One of the main things that bugs me is the ability descriptions. I have them popping up on the left side of the screen here, and frankly I don't love them. I'd love to have a more dedicated place in the screen where they can always show up rather than having them cover up the skills. But unfortunately there wasn't a lot of screen real estate to work with here. I think part of the issue that I'm having is that a lot of my UI isn't really scaled properly. Basically, there are different pixel sizes all over the UI, and they don't even correspond with the pixel sizes in the game. This makes the project feel less cohesive. I was actually hoping to fix that up for this devlog, but unfortunately I think that's going to take a lot of time and it won't be super exciting to watch. It'll mostly consist of me redoing the UIs and scaling up the buttons correctly and all of that stuff. It's not the most exciting stuff, just kind of tedious work. I need to do it soon though, because I think if I did that, I'll be able to scale the notebook UI down, giving me more room in the screen overall. But I think this is a good place to leave it for this devlog. I've gotten a lot done this week and I'm really happy with the progress that the skills and abilities have made and how they've contributed to the combat. I'm also really happy working on some new monsters and actually implementing them into the game. As always, I'd love people's feedback on all the stuff I showed today. Also, a huge thank you to everyone who's watching these videos and following me on Twitter. It's really awesome sharing this stuff with you guys, and I really love the feedback I've been getting. If you're new here and you want to follow Amberroot's development, consider subscribing and check out my Twitter because I tend to post some stuff as I work on these devlogs on there. If you like this video, hit the like button, and I hope you'll join me for the next devlog. As always, thank you for watching.